Well, as most of you probably know, Friday was St. Patrick's Day. And on St. Patrick's Day, people wear green, and so I'm wearing my green stole this morning and my green shirt in honor of that. People wear green, they eat corned beef and cabbage, and the Chicago River, in my memory, turns a deep, beautiful green on that day. I don't know if they still do that in Chicago, but I've been there when it did, and it was really an interesting experience. And people drink a lot of green beer on St. Patrick's Day, too. These are all American traditions. But who the heck was St. Patrick anyway? And what does St. Patrick have to do with drinking green beer and the Chicago River turning green and corned beef and cabbage? And who are the Celts anyway? Who are the Celtic people? Well, the word Celt or Celtic actually comes from a Greek word, keltos, and it means something like the other or the stranger. Well, the Celts, turns out, from my understanding, never called themselves by that name. Greeks fought Galatians and Romans fought the Gauls, and both of those groups were Celts. So today, however, traditions, continue on in various ways. And the League of Celtic Nations, which consists of, how many can name the League of Celtic Nations? There's Wales, Scotland, Ireland, obviously, the Isle of Man, Cornwall, and Brittany. All right, so a nice little history lesson there. This League of Nations attempts to preserve the Celtic language and its traditions. But St. Patrick's Day, I have come painfully to find out, is really an American Irish holiday. I recently heard a story that some of you probably heard too, that in Ireland people are celebrating probably not so much what we celebrate here, but they're celebrating the arrival of spring. And so they do different things to mark the coming of spring. But it reminds me of a similar kind of experience that I had quite a while ago now at Sumi College, and I recall some native Finlanders saying the same thing about St. Urho's Day that we were celebrating at Sumi College during those years. The native Finns were wondering what was going on around them when people were gearing up to herd grasshoppers and things like that. And this native Finn said to an American group of students, well, what is this St. Urho's Day? And an American student responded, well, it's a Finnish holiday. And the Finlander said, no, it's not. Ended that discussion. So some of the ancient Celtic people influenced, however, the world of spirituality by peregrinating. Do you know what I mean by that? Peregrinate means to walk. Okay, that's enough. I can sit down now. Right? To peregrinate means to walk, meaning they traveled by foot. They walked. Celtic monasticism is colored by the peregrinations of the Celtic saints. They were travelers who journeyed far and wide, not just walking, however, but sometimes they journeyed in tiny boats on the sea, often without oars and without sails, and often without even a specific destination, because they were content to go where God took them. Wow. 3 Irishmen once drifted over the sea for 7 days without oars, and they were found, they were discovered and saved and brought to the court of the Anglo-Saxon King Alfred. When asked where they were heading, they responded that they stole away because they wanted, for the love of God, to be on pilgrimage we cared not where. Road trip, right? We usually have a destination in mind, but sometimes we just go out and wander. Well, they were wandering with a purpose. Well, what was that purpose? Why were they journeying in that way? To come closer to God. Apparently, they didn't need no stinking oars or sails in those days, But Swedish diplomat and author Dag Hammarskjöld must have known what this journey meant when he said, "The longest journey is the journey inward." The peregrinations of the Celtic saints were ways of expressing outwardly a journey which they undertook inwardly. And with that in mind, I found this statement by a Celt named Columbanus, who was quick to remind his companions, his companion peregrinators, "Let us not love the roadway rather than the homeland, lest we lose our eternal home. Therefore, let this principle abide with us, that on the road we live as travelers, as pilgrims, as guests of the world." Jack Kerouac and his merry band of pranksters had nothing on these folks, I'll tell you. The idea is that which we learn inwardly determines how we live in an outward fashion. And how we live outwardly, no matter where we are, is guided by a corresponding inward journey. They peregrinated to achieve stability of soul, a constant striving after God in their understanding, remaining inwardly focused while being constantly on the move. Can you think of ways that we do that today? Inward focus while moving. I'm thinking of Tai Chi. I'm thinking of a book that I sort of grew up with called The Zen of Running. You know, any movement where it's combined with meditation reminds me of the principle behind these Celtic monastic people. Well, St. Patrick was one of the best-known peregrini. I'm just going to use that word all over the place here. He was born in 387 of the Common Era. Patrick was a Briton who was captured by Irish pirates at the age of 16, and he was enslaved for 6 years. Now, how much of this is true and how much of it's legend, I don't know. But during this period, he apparently endured things like solitude and hunger and lack of clothing and cold. But he kept the will to live through an intense life of prayer. And finally, Patrick heard a voice telling him that his ship was ready. But he didn't have one. So trusting in the voice, which of course reminds me of the movie Field of Dreams, telling someone to build a baseball field in the middle of a cornfield in Iowa. By the way, my organist and pianist in my first congregation in Chelan, Washington, was from that area, and she knew that field very well. Just kind of an interesting little tidbit. So trusting in this voice that told St. Patrick to make a 200-mile journey, he did that, and he found then a group of sailors who took him on their ship, and then later he was able to return to Britain and then finally to Ireland 47 years later, where legend says he drove the snakes out of Ireland. And indeed, there are no native snakes on the Emerald Isle. Now, what St. Patrick had to do that, I'm not quite sure, but, well, you know, it's a great story, huh? Many of the stories in St. Patrick's life are legend, but he did help spread Christianity to Ireland, which was pagan at the time, and I don't say that as a criticism at all. In that region, it was customary for people to celebrate the Feast of Beltane on May 1st in honor of the sun god, Bel. So during the fertility feast, one fire was lit from which all other fires in Ireland were then lit. On the Christian Holy Saturday in 433 of the Common Era, while the High King prepared to extinguish all the fires in the land but his own, Patrick lit a fire on a nearby hill and was then ordered to appear before the king. And as he made his way there to the king, he began to chant a hymn known as the breastplate of Patrick, called the Lorica, or Deer's Cry. And as Patrick passed by, all that the king saw were deer. It's a very long group of words, very Trinitarian in its topic, but I chose these today. I used to use this as a responsive reading quite often, and it's a beautiful piece from that Lorica or Deer's Cry, attributed to St. Patrick. I arise today through the strength of heaven, light of the sun, splendor of fire, speed of lightning, swiftness of the wind, depth of the sea, stability of the earth, firmness of the rock. I arise today through God's strength to pilot me, God's might to uphold me, God's wisdom to guide me, God's eye to look before me, God's ear to hear me, God's word to speak for me, God's hand to guard me, God's way to lie before me, God's shield to protect me, and God's host to save me. Well, what can we today learn from spiritual and religious people of that time? Church theology is typically divided by East and West. It's an interesting, with stark differences in ways of seeing things and how one frames, how one conceptualizes creation, how one understands God, or how one names God, and our role then as human beings in the world. Stark differences between East and West. Recognized as more internal than external, mysticism is often considered Eastern, and Celtic spirituality falls within this inner or Eastern category. Western tradition, which is what most of us have probably experienced all of our lives, reduces God to either divine intellect or divine will, often resulting in a very harsh or hard holy presence. Judgment and sin and fear and guilt are the consequences of such a caricature of God, and has led people, I imagine some of you are some of those people, over time to seek something different. I personally like German philosopher Martin Heidegger's statement that, I quote, "No one could dance in the presence of such a dead, abstract God." I'm not sure that Martin Heidegger was a dancer, but I don't know. Many people have lost a sense of participation within and a vision of nature as seamless in its naturalness. But we too, as human beings, are nature. Not just part of nature, we are nature. When we as a human species lost a sense of how we fit in the universe, we replaced it with things like psychoanalysis to deal with the disconnectedness of our inner world to the outer world of which we are a part. I didn't make that up. That's one of the most profound ideas I've ever learned in theology and psychology. When we lost a sense of how we fit, we had to invent things like psychoanalysis to deal with our disconnectedness between myself and the world around me. But this is also why I would argue that we need the mystic's way of understanding and living. Celtic spirituality can allow us to imagine, to dream, and then to maybe even articulate the wonderful and rich variety of what some Irish people would call the divine imagination. Breaking away from the traditional categories of will and intellect and opening the senses to the limitless wildness and tenderness of that which some call God. So if we set aside rationalization, our ways of thinking, and try to imagine for a moment how strange it is to be here, to be on the earth, not just to be here. I'm not saying you're a bunch of strangers, okay, but to be here in existence on the earth. And the surprise perhaps even begins with the first cry of shock when we are birthed into a much different place from where we were conceived and nurtured. Our world conditions us to forget this incredible mystery that we are born into. And so, sadly, it takes effort to experience the ocean. It takes effort to experience the big lake and the ancient antiphon of the waves striking the shore in their beautiful and trustable rhythm. Or the light of day appearing all along the horizon around us, or the sunset that cries out a wonderful valediction of a day well lived by the universe. It takes effort to do those things, to experience those things. Twilight or dawn, this traditional time between day and night or night and day, echoes the place in the heart, this threshold where the imagination lives and where the imagination can meet the tenderness and the greatest presence of all, the presence of Creator and creation, or that which is. It is this inward heart in which we are able to begin to recognize our part in all things created. Some of our foundational stories, and I talked about this the last time I was here, one of those foundational stories tells us that we are ultimate strangers on the earth, that we are made of clay. And I'm not saying this is wrong, I'm just saying this is one of our foundational stories. We are made of clay, and we have moved out of the clay. We breathe the air, yet we are not the air, and we are not in the air. And we are full of passion that creates a deep longing for wholeness, to be part of all that is. And we are filled with a restlessness, a longing to come home or to be home. The most ancient word for home in every language is the word for God, goddess, or the divine. Well, Celtic spirituality teaches that all our tenderness comes from that divine place within the human heart. In the Western mind, the divine is distant from us. Other religious imaginations tell us there's nothing nearer to us than the presence of the divine. Some imagine the divine as the great circle that embraces all of life. In every place you stand in the world, you are always within this circle. If you are on the land, then the circle of the horizon is all around you. If you are on the sea, or in the desert, or in the mountains, or at night, this great circle of the cosmos and the night sky embraces you completely. The Celtic tradition imagines God as this ultimate circle that embraces everything. And this is also very common to earth-based religions. Oglala Lakota holy man, Black Elk, once said, "The first peace, P-E-A-C-E, the first peace, which is the most important, is that which comes within the souls of people when they realize their relationship, their oneness with the universe and all its powers, and when they realize that at the center of the universe dwells the Great Spirit, and that this center is really everywhere. It is within each of us." So in that understanding, the divine then is not objective, it is not separate, it is not other. The divine gathers and includes everything. So we don't need then as human beings to strain or to reach outside ourselves to an abstract and a distant or a cold God, because God is not outside of anything. God is within each of us. And the most special place within each of us is that place where the divine presence and our own presence come together, live together. So in that understanding, then, we are home in the divine, in all that is. We are home. So now go back a little bit in your imagination to these people out on the sea. Imagine coming upon yourself. You are one of these people in a little canoe, like the boats the Celtic monks set sail in with no paddles and no oars. And maybe this has happened to you out on Lake Superior, so try to put yourself back there if you dare to. Imagine yourself out there in a little canoe like this. You are in the midst of a great ocean, and the canoe is the contour of and shelter of your mind. That's the canoe that you were in, the shelter and the contour of your mind. And that canoe then mirrors back to you how you have found yourself and where your journey might lie. When we imagine then the hundreds of millions of years that have passed, and we were never really there. And then imagine the hundreds of millions of years that will pass after our death. No one knows where we have really come from and where and how the journey began. And no human being asked to be here. No human being asked to come into the earth. We are simply here. Back to Martin Heidegger, who talks about Geworfenheit. The word werfen auf Deutsch means to throw. To werfen means to throw. And Geworfenheit refers to thrownness of human existence. We are thrown into it. We are just here. Now. So you're on a journey. And when you ask a person who is also on a journey, you meet someone along the way, you ask them who they are, part of that answer is usually where they are from. It's not a trite, it becomes trite when that's always the follow-up question, but it's a very deep understanding. Some religious understandings have a different conception of this, so a conversation can be had about where you are from, but this particular Celtic understanding suggests that our ultimate address, where we are from, is that we do not belong just to a particular place or a land or a people or a community. We belong to, we are home in the divine that is within us and all around us. We are in it, and it is sacred. Now, that's very different from some other thoughts, and so that's why I say it begs a conversation to be had. But that's where the Celtic understanding is. And it reminded me of this thought from the mystic Catholic monk Thomas Merton in his book, Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander, and I think Merton really got this understanding very well. And I quote, he was writing about one particular aspect of creation. And it's coming. Eventually we'll get there. I quote, "Let me say this before rain becomes a utility that they can plan and distribute for money. By they, I mean the people who cannot understand that rain is a festival, who do not appreciate its gratuity, who to that what has no price has no value, that what cannot be sold is not real, so that the only way to make something actual is to place it on the market. The time will come when they will sell you even your rain. At the moment, it is still free, and I am in it. I celebrate its gratuity and its meaninglessness." End quote. Now, I understand if you happen to be in parts of California right now, that statement might mean something very different. But that's part of the wildness of nature and what happens to wildness when we stimulate it and tease it and taunt it. But on to other positive things. Imagine, for example, a divine artist who creates a beautiful and an intricate world made up of a profusion of differentiation everywhere. One can only imagine why. it is this way. Perhaps the fullness within the divine creativity called for expression. And if not expression, then the divine would have imploded or been locked away in some asylum for gods that didn't live full enough. Creator then is an artist who dared believe in the grandeur of possibility. And the door of our own imagination and artistry is open or can be opened to reflect the wonder of all that is. And we typically think of the great ones. We think of Michelangelo, who was a great sculptor. But the mountains from which the material that he worked with came, wow. Impressionists like Monet were great painters of landscapes, capturing reflections of the real thing. Van Gogh's Starry, Starry Night. If you want to put that up right now, you can. Van Gogh's... What's that? Okay, all right. Van Gogh's Starry, Starry Night portrays the night sky, but it is still an image of the living, organic night that surrounds us and the sacred dust of which we are made. There it is. Sacred dust. Ashes to ashes and dust to dust. That's our future and our past. Divine imagination has created everything that is here. And I think of the German language through Heidegger, but the word alles, A-L-L-E-S, of Deutsch means all things. And the Greek words tapanta mean all things. It means everything. The ancient teaching of creatio ex nihilo, a creation out of nothing, is a lovely kind of poetry which alerts us to a time when there was nothing, or there was silence, and ever so deftly out of that nothing, or in the Buddhist understanding, there was no thing, a whisper called forth everything that is here. In alles, in tapanta, all things, everything, the divine imagination is among us, around us, and within us. And I'm finishing up here, and it leads me to say it's all about incredible originality. It's all from nowhere, or created out of nothing, or creation begets more creation. It is, we are relentlessly original. In every moment of our lives, the stream of consciousness gives birth to that which is new within us. Heraclitus said, you can't step in the same river twice because both you and the river have changed. You are always constantly new and different within you. And so is everything else. As imagination then awakens and as spring begins to arrive, we are reminded of this. We begin to realize that one of the great journeys in life is faithfulness to your own imagination and your own originality. All life then becomes sacramental as we participate in the divine that lives inside our hearts and in the wide universe of all things. And in that way, we are all artists, right? So we're going to sing. We're going to sing a song. And I would invite you to let the words and the music allow your hearts and minds to imagine that we are on a journey. Thank you. Amen.